Okay, I think we are ready to get started. Oh, there are my co-hosts. I was having a moment of not recognizing if anyone can I get a thumbs up and make sure everyone can hear me? Because all of a sudden it seems quiet. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, welcome to the second in our series of 4 conversations about cooking, cookbooks, and history. For those of you who weren't here last time, I'm Jennifer Duncan. I'm the head of Utah State University Special Collections and Archives, and I'm the curator who oversees our book collections. I again want to thank Tammy Proctor and the History Department for sponsoring this series. Some of you met Tammy virtually last month when she spoke about 18th century British cooking. She's back again with us tonight with her colleague Jonah Bibo to help us manage the PowerPoint and the Q&A. So for those of you who are new to our Eating the Past series, welcome. We are posting all of these recordings to both the history and the library websites, as well as the information about how to prepare the recipes that our scholar cooks are discussing. And I have asked Jonah or Tammy, one of you guys, if you can push out the link to that information in the chat so that folks can grab it if you want to see the previous recording or if you want to see the recipes that we've got. This Zoom series is focusing on recipes taken from the cookbook collections at the Utah State University Special Collections and Archives. We use those not only to document the history of the Intermountain West, but also to provide a broader primary source literacy tools through the study of foodways and culinary history. So as I said last time, these cookbooks contribute to our broader understanding of historical economies, politics, and mentalités. They are excellent primary sources for our student researchers. I briefly talked about the USU Library's cookbook collections last month. So if you're interested in that, you should take a quick listen to my introductory remarks from the last section, which are posted on that library guide that I just had them sent to our chat. Tonight, we are going to be hearing from 2 members of the Utah State University History Department, Dr. Jamie Sanders, whose academic work focuses on 19th century political culture in Latin America, and Dr. Eliza Rosenberg, who's part of our religious studies program in the history department. She teaches classes about early Christianity, Judaism, and biblical studies. Thank you both so much for agreeing to open your kitchens to our audience tonight and for being willing to participate in our series. So I think Tammy's running the slides. If you can get the first slide up, I am going to start talking about Jamie's cookbook. So tonight, Jamie is going to be cooking a tortilla soup from a small collection of late 19th, early 20th century Mexican chapbook series entitled La Cocina en el Bolsillo. And please excuse my Spanish. I have not had Spanish since my sophomore year in college. So I'm going to attempt to be proper about it. La Cocina en el Bolsillo literally translates to the kitchen in the pocket. I am loosely translating it here as pocket cooking. I don't know if you can get a sense of the scale of these little volumes from the images here, but they're about 15 centimeters high, and each one's only about 20 pages long. They're really more like little booklets that would fit inside your pocket. Each one includes a selection of about 20 recipes, many but not all of which are traditionally Mexican cooking. The USU libraries own 7 of these little chapbooks. They run from 1890 to 1913. And the earliest, the one appearing on, which is the earliest one, is appearing to the left of your screen. La Cocina en el Bolsillo was the project of Antonio Vanegas Arroyo, a Mexican printer publisher whose Mexico City workshop produced small paperbacks of all kinds of popular subjects, from cookery to magic tricks. And we know this because these books are advertised on the backs of one of these little cookbooks. The University of Texas at San Antonio Library also has a small collection of these works, and they have really well documented them on their historic cooking blog. And they noted that Antonio Vanegas Arroyo's works were widely distributed throughout Mexico and as far north as San Antonio. They sold for about 10 cents a piece. So they were reasonably affordable because other books at that time sold for maybe $1 or so. You may wonder why USU would have these little chapbooks. I purchased them at the California Antiquarian Book Fair 2 years ago. And the reason is actually the illustrator who designed the later covers for these little guys. And in this case, it's the cover on the right-hand side, where the matron is holding a turkey and supervising a younger woman, maybe that's her maid, and that younger woman is grinding corn. So as you'll see, both of these books are really potentially useful for both printmaking courses and for history courses. So Tammy, if you can move us to the next slide. So José Guadalupe Posada was a Mexican illustrator and printmaker, and you see him as a boy depicted on the left. And he became really well known for his popular illustrations of daily life and political affairs, including life under the dictatorship of Porfirio Díaz. He has actually been called the printmaker to the Mexican people, and he was later recognized as a major influence by the great Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. And you can see here is one of his illustrations of a assault on a train here on the right-hand side. Can I get the next slide? Posada is also known for his development of the printed Mexican calavera, which the skull images that have recently enjoyed such a resurgence in contemporary popular culture. So together, Antonio Vanegas Arroyo and José Guadalupe Posada produced thousands of satirical broadsides. So here, let's see, actually, here on the right, if you look closely, you can see an image of Antonio Vanegas Arroyo that was designed by Posada, and Arroyo is depicted as a calavera himself, and you can see his printmaking shop behind him. And then the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, tonight, Jamie is going to be making a tortilla soup from La Cocina in El Bolsillo #2. You'll see the title page of that booklet here, along with the table of contents, which, as I mentioned, contains about 20 food recipes and a few pulques, which I was unable to convince Jamie to make. Our copy in the library here is really well loved. It's got little oil spots dotting the pages, and this recipe is cooking from appears on the right. So as you'll recall from last month when Tammy and Phoebe talked about the recipes not being incredibly detailed, you'll see that's a similar situation here. And I am going to turn it over to him so that we can hear a little something about tortilla soup, Sopa de Tortilla. So Jamie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And so as Jennifer mentioned, I picked Sopa de Tortilla out of the possibilities from these cookbooks that were published, right around the time of the turn of the century in Mexico, late 19th century, early 20th century. And I just want to start out by saying that I am not a specialist in 19th century Mexican cooking, but I am a specialist in 19th century Mexico political culture. So I'm going to use talking about Sopa de Tortilla to sort of show the connections to maize, to corn, in 3 moments in Mexican history. And we'll start with looking at the ingredients in the soup. And so could we roll the first video?
Okay, let's just start with going through some of the ingredients you need to make sopa de tortilla, which is a fairly simple dish and not too many ingredients. And we're going to talk about this historically by looking at which ingredients are from the Old World and which are from the New World. Sopa de tortilla, there's a variant, or sometimes it's called sopa azteca, and sort of implying that this is a pre-Columbian dish, but from the ingredients we know, at least in its modern form, it emerged sometime after the conquest of Mexico, but it is a dish from central Mexico. And so let's look at those ingredients. And first we'll go with the New World ingredients. And of course we have pasilla chiles, epazote, an herb. We have tomatoes. Again, some people are surprised, if you love Italian cuisine, that tomatoes are a New World dish. There's no red sauce before they're brought over to Europe after the conquest. But of course the dish is named after the tortilla. And tortillas are definitely a New World dish. These existed, tortillas were, invented long before the conquest of the New World by Europeans, by the Native Americans living in the New World, and in Mesoamerica. And a tortilla traditionally is made just of corn that's been soaked in lime water, not lime the citrus fruit, which is actually its Old World, but lime the mineral, and salt and water, and that's it. It goes in tortillas. And we have some that we've already sort of cut up into strips for this recipe. But from the old world, we have chicken broth, which I made last night. And again, chickens are an old world animal. We have onions, garlic, both old world plants, and we have lard from a pig, also an old world creature. And if you're wondering why certain dishes taste so much better in a restaurant than at home, it's because they're using lard, which you should do too.
All right, thank you. Okay, so as we saw, sopa de tortilla, the main ingredient are tortillas, of course, and they're made from maize or corn. And corn is, of course, a New World crop, and it was domesticated about 9,000 years ago, or 7,000 BCE, in Mexico, and so quite a long time ago. And it's really one of the signature achievements of human ingenuity that you could turn this grass, teosinte, which was a naturally occurring plant in Mexico, into maize. So it was an amazing feat of genetic engineering that Mesoamerican farmers accomplished over thousands of years of carefully cultivating this grass and turning it into maize, or what we often call corn. And you can see its evolution in those pictures there. So again, this happened quite a long time ago. I just want to note for you history nerds that Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel claims it was not until about 3,500 BCE that maize was domesticated, in his argument that the late adoption of agriculture in the Americas explains the European conquest. But he's wrong about that, as he is about many things. And so maize, this was happened in central Mexico, and then spread from there into the Valley of Mexico, and then across the Americas. And this was part of a much larger process of plant domestication that took place in the Americas. If we could have the next slide. Where obviously we already have maize, we also have chiles, we have beans, and we have potatoes. So those were domesticated in South America independently. And again, many of these crops would then spread across the Americas from their homeland. And then, so the next slide, please. And grown together, and maize, squash, and beans were often grown together in the same garden plot. And you could grow them together because, as you can see, the squash sort of spreads out along the bottom. The maize grows straight up, and then beans will sort of use the maize as a support and crawl up the maize plant. And these three plants together would produce an amazing number of calories per hectare planted, and a significant amount of protein, which was very important since there really weren't a lot of domesticated animals in the Americas. And so by around 5,000 BCE, we have in the archaeological record manos y metates. These are the stones used to grind ground maize into a corn flour, which is again the first step in making tortillas. And you see that in the image there of one of the cookbooks that in this series that we were using. And this would have been just hours each day were spent mostly by women as this labor in grinding maize as a sort of a daily chore. And we don't know exactly when the tortilla itself was invented. We have in the archaeological record evidence of comales, the sort of cooking stones, by about 700 BCE, but probably tortillas were invented before that. Before that time, but certainly by that point, the classic tortilla had been invented in Mesoamerica, and so maize was so central to the diet in this region. It may have provided 80% of the calories for ancient Mesoamerican cultures, and I think one just sort of symbolic point to show how important it was that in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica or the Aztecs, babies were called maize blossoms, as it was just so central to to their society. This plant maize. All right, now let's start the next video to show some preparation of sopa de tortilla.
All right, so now we're actually going to cook our sopa de tortilla. And the recipe we're using, again, from the 1890s is, if we can focus on this for a second, is very inexact. It's very basic. It's just sort of the ingredients and a few steps listed. No quantities, no exact amounts, know exactly how you're going to do a lot of this. And as Phoebe talked about last time, cooking cookbook styles change over time. Although this style is coming back into fashion. One of my favorite cookbooks by Mark Bittman uses this sort of less is more style, letting you just sort of play around with the recipe and make it your own, which is actually more fun and less like, oh, you have to do everything, this exact amount of this, because most cooking will work out fine this way. And so we're going to start with, we've heated some lard in our soup pot here, and we're going to start by frying our tomatoes and onions. It just said, fry some tomatoes and onions that are cut up. It didn't say much else. So we're just gonna give this a go. Okay, so now in this step, we're going to saute our pasilla chilies. So we're just gonna throw them in the pan here with some of the lard. And we won't cook them very long. We just want to sort of crisp them up a little bit. We will also add the broth to our mixture of tomato, onion, and we added some garlic as well. So we're just going to dump this broth in here. And now we're going to fry up the tortillas. Tortilla soup is a great way to use up some tortillas that are past their prime, because you're going to fry them up anyway. We cut them into strips. We're just going to throw some of these into our hot lard. It's a nice sound. So, except for one big difference we're going to talk about later on in the final video, tortilla soup in this recipe from the 1890s seems very similar to tortilla soup that you might find today in a restaurant you might make today. There's not a whole lot of differences. So it's very similar, except for, again, that one we'll talk about later on. And so, again, this is a 19th century recipe. A restaurant such as the Bar Opera in Mexico City, which was open in the 1890s, you may well have served a tortilla soup not too different from the one you could get there today, or at least the one that I got there the last time I was in the Bar Opera. So the recipe just says to fry these until golden. So that's what we're going to do.
Okay. Now we're going to jump ahead in time to the period in which these cookbooks were printed, as Jennifer talked about, to the 1890s. And this is right in the heart of a period in Mexican history called the Porfiriato, which is when Porfirio Díaz ruled Mexico for decades. And his project was to restrict a very vibrant democracy Mexico had enjoyed in previous years, with the idea of creating a more orderly, peaceful society to attract foreign investment. And for a while, his plan worked. Foreign investment poured in. Next slide. And thousands of miles of railroads were built across Mexico. Next slide. Mexico became the third largest oil producer in the world. But the cost of this was massive land concentration, as land was taken from small farmers in a variety of ways and absorbed by large haciendas that were geared toward export agriculture. So in central Mexico, about 90% of Mexican villages lost their land. Meanwhile, one family in northern Mexico owned 15 million acres. And so this loss of land led in part to the Mexican Revolution, which erupted in 1910, again, right when the series was being produced. And it was led in central Mexico by Emiliano Zapata, who represented mostly small farmers whose, again, principal crop was maize. And so Zapata was from a small village in Anaquilco, and he was elected by his village to defend the village's lands against a hacienda that was absorbing their lands to produce sugar. Again, replacing this more marketable crop for the corn that they had been growing. And so he and his followers, called the Zapatistas, we can see in the next slide, fought in the revolution to demand land back. And Zapata's Plan de Ayala demanded that the land stolen from these villagers be returned, and that these haciendas be divided up and the land returned to these villages. Zapata himself dies during the Mexican Revolution. However, by the 1930s, under Lázaro Cárdenas, the president of Mexico, land was finally restored to many Mexican villages, about 45 million acres to 12,000 different villages under his revolutionary government. And you see that here in this Diego Rivera mural, the land being returned to people dressed in the traditional dress of Zapatistas. The revolution also promoted Mexican national cuisine, celebrating the indigenous heritage, and under the Porfiriato, more European elements had been promoted instead. Okay, let's now go to the third video, and we'll see how we finish up our Sopa de Tortilla.
All right, while you were gone, I added the epazote. It's a delicate herb, so you don't want to cook it too long, to maintain its flavor, and just to add some flavor to the soup. But if you looked at the soup there, you're thinking, that doesn't look like sopa de tortilla that I've had. Sopa de tortilla is smooth, and this is all chunky and everything. Well, the recipe said nothing about liquefying your soup in some way. Now, that may be because they just assumed that you would know to do that, or that may be that that was the big difference between a modern, current day sopa de tortilla and one from the 19th century. I just don't know the answer to that. But I'm going to liquefy that. and so we're going to take out our epazote real quick. Put it out. And then, much like how many careless historians use terms like Western civilization anachronistically, we're going to anachronistically use an immersion blender here. So for those caring about historical accuracy, you probably don't want to watch this part. Okay, we blended our sopa to make it nice and smooth now. Again, they may have done this in the 19th century, you're saying, but they didn't have immersion blenders back then. But they may have used a food mill or a sieve or a mortar and pestle. Again, not quite sure there. But we blended it up. We've added some of the fried tortilla strips to our bowl. And then we're going to spoon over some of the soup. And the recipe simply says to add chile pasilla frito entero. We'll throw that on there. And then maybe add a few more strips to make it look nice. Now, the recipe doesn't mention anything else, but often sopa de tortilla today is served with accompaniments of avocado, maybe a lime, cotija cheese, sour cream, some shredded whole chicken. You can add any of these things. We'll just throw in a few avocado slices to make it look pretty. And there is our sopa de tortilla. Buen provecho.
Okay, now we're going to get to, in our last historical moment, we're going to go up to more or less the present and look at what's going on with corn in Mexico today. And there was a massive transition beginning in the 80s and 90s to the present, as Mexico began to turn away from its revolutionary heritage and embrace neoliberal economic reforms. That this allowed foreigners to own land, which had been prohibited before, and Mexico really stopped subsidizing small farmers as much. And of course, as part of this was the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which in 1994 opened up the Mexican market to imports of U.S. corn, which, as you see from this chart, flood into the Mexican market. And so the price paid to Mexican farmers for corn fell by about 66% over this time period with this competition from abroad or from the U.S. and reduced price supports. And so in this period, over 2 million Mexican small farmers basically have to give up farming. They can't make a go of it under these conditions. And their land begins to switch from growing corn, from maize, as it traditionally had been grown, to other crops, mostly crops that would be sold into the U.S. as winter vegetables and fruits, such as avocados, mangoes, lemon, and limes, as you see in this chart, as those sort of increased in land use. And so these farming jobs were theoretically going to be replaced with manufacturing jobs, mostly along the U.S.-Mexican border. However, there weren't enough of those jobs, and many of those plants also would close at various times and move to East or Southeast Asia as companies pursued even greater profits and cheaper labor cost. And so many of these small farmers who had first migrated up to the border to work in these plants, then later on would cross over into El Norte, into the United States, again looking for work. And so we see the connection here between, again, the decline of corn farming and the immigration from Mexico into the United States. Okay, thank you very much. I'll return things back over to Jennifer now, and thanks for cooking Sopa de Tortilla with me.
I'm muted. I was doing the terrible Zoom thing where you start talking and you're muted. That was not good. Thank you, Jamie. I want to let everyone know that Sopa de Tortilla was amazing. It was totally delicious. So thank you. Thank you for that presentation, and thank you for the sopa. We are going to switch gears a little bit now. And we're going to look at another very different 19th century cookbook. It is called Jennie June's American Cookery Book. So Jennie June is the pseudonym of one Jane Cunningham Crowley. She's the daughter of a Congregationalist minister who attended public schools and was largely self-educated from her father's and brother's libraries. Jane Cunningham arrived in New York City in 1855 at the age of 25 with the goal of writing as a journalist. And she sold her first news stories to the New York Tribune that year, primarily focusing on theater and other subjects that her editor thought would appeal to women. She kind of reminds me of Jo March. She soon married another aspiring journalist named David Crowley, with whom she had 5 children. And she ultimately became the primary breadwinner of her family as an author. She was also known as instrumental to the beginning of the movement to found women's clubs. That was following an incident when Charles Dickens was visiting New York and women were not allowed to attend the club where he was speaking. She's considered a pioneering feminist. And if you can see here on the right side of the screen, I don't know that you can see that, but down at the very bottom left, you can see that in this Jennie June American Cookery book, she included recipes from prominent figures. And this one is Susan B. Anthony's apple tapioca pudding, which I thought was fun. The Jennie June American Cookery book reinforces Crowley's insistence that while women could excel in the workforce and they actually deserved equal pay with men when they worked equal work, ultimately she thought that women's most important work was expert care for the home. And she thought that was a skill that was being lost with industrialization. Next slide. So at this point, you may be wondering, why are we discussing this cookbook authored by the daughter of a Congregationalist minister who was herself not Jewish? The first point I want to remind everyone is that this program does focus on cookbooks that we hold here at USU Special Collections. Esther Levy's Jewish cookbook from 1871 is really considered one of the first American cookbooks to focus exclusively on Jewish cooking. But we don't have a copy of that book. I did go looking for it. It's currently for sale for $22,000. So if anyone would like to make a donation to the library, I would love to have you assist us. But the second point is that this cookbook, we have the 1878 edition, not the original 1866. It's considered the first American cookbook to include a subsection related to Jewish cookery. And it's got a chapter tucked in the back entitled Jewish Receipts, which were, and if you can see this there, they were vouched for as being, quote, original and reliable, the contributions of a superior Jewish housekeeper in New York. It's unknown who this person might be, but it's also notable that Crowley had included another small section of recipes in this cookbook from the Oneida community from central New York State. So she did have several small little groups of recipes pulled out from the kind of more general cookery book. Next slide. So a few points to note regarding our copy of Jennie June. Our copy is bound in turquoise Victorian cloth binding. So this cloth binding style became very popular in the 19th and early 20th century, and it was really meant to replicate leather embossing, but obviously is less expensive because it's cloth and not leather. It could be very elaborate. It could have gilt borders and fanciful designs on the cover and the spine. And many of you have probably seen these Victorian cloth bindings in antique shops or in historic homes. As you can see, ours is really well loved. It's very scuffed up, and you can see somebody was clearly using it to cook. And we kind of have an idea who that might be. So next slide. Inside, you'll see there's a dedication to the young housekeepers of America, kind of harkening back to that idea that Jane Cunningham thought that the key was that you needed to be an excellent housekeeper first, but there's also this loving inscription to a Julia in hopes of many good dinners. The location is also noted. We don't know who Julia is, but we know that a young woman named Julia received this cookbook, and it was in Johnstown, New York. That's a small community. It's about 2/3 of the way between Oneida and Albany, the capital of New York State. And this is just one thing I really love about these older books, wondering who this Julia was. And I have no way of knowing, but you can have all kinds of imaginings about it. This copy is housed in a collection that I mentioned last time, the J. Anderson Foodways Folk Collection. And with that, I am going to hand it over. Well, we're going to see a video of Eliza's, but Eliza has cooked from the Jewish receipts. She has adapted the hickory nut cake recipe, and I believe we're going to watch her video first.
This is a recipe for a hickory nut cake. And hickory nuts, it seems, were much more widely used in earlier American cuisine than they are today. I looked around for hickory seeds. They are quite hard to come by. I looked around a little bit more, and I found that most people say the closest substitute is pecans. So some pecans for the pint or the 2 cups of nuts called for in the recipe. But I got to thinking, A, my taste buds have never really warmed to pecans, and B, there are reasons for thinking that you could make this cake a suitable Purim dish. And in many Jewish communities, almonds are traditional for Purim. So for the other component of the nut, I used a bunch of almonds. The recipe doesn't mention whether you're supposed to sift the 2 cups or the 3 cups of flour that you use. I decided it would be better if I did sift it. It also calls for 2 cups of sugar in addition to the 3 cups of flour. That's an awful lot of sugar. So I halved that. I think 1 cup of sugar will be just fine. It also calls for half a teaspoon of baking soda, which was a fairly new ingredient at this point in 1878 when this edition of the cookbook was published. But it quickly became popular as a quick leavener. It calls for half a teaspoon because I'm cooking above 1,500 meters of altitude. I used a bit more, closer to a full teaspoon of the baking soda. I also am adding a pinch of salt, which is not called for in the recipe, but you kind of need that little pinch to bring out the other flavors. There are a couple of other reasons we can imagine that this might be a recipe that's used for the holiday of Purim. And first, it calls for milk and butter. And in a traditional Jewish household, you wouldn't eat anything with dairy ingredients in the same meal as anything with meat ingredients. And at least at this point in the 19th century, most American Jews were German American Jews. And like everybody else in earlier modern Europe, especially in the 19th century, they were eating a lot of meat. Now, Purim, traditionally, there's a sense that Queen Esther maintained a vegetarian diet in the palace, or at least a pescatarian diet, so as not to violate kosher laws. So I like to imagine that this could be served with fish. I have used plant substitutes. You can easily make this a plant dish, but I like to think that it could be made for Purim. Nuts are also traditional at Purim because, again, they're said to be part of Queen Esther's diet. And finally, in Ashkenazi or Northern European Jewish communities, poppy seeds are traditional. So I went ahead and added some poppy seeds. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how this is, in a sense, a Jewish recipe and what it means to have a Jewish section in this particular cookbook. Many of you are probably familiar with Jewish dietary laws to some extent, the kosher laws. And if you go into any supermarket, a lot of the packaged foods will have various signs on them indicating which certifying body will guarantee which kosher status. And this is just one that's common in Canada, which is a smaller range because it's a smaller population. My personal favorite is that the entire state of, is this Wisconsin? I'm going to call this Wisconsin. You can, in keeping with kosher laws, consume the entire state of Wisconsin, although for digestive reasons, I would recommend against it. So Jewish dietary laws, kosher laws, really focus on animal products. If it's an entirely plant-based product, it's almost by definition kosher. But there are restrictions on flesh, and there's a strict separation between meat and dairy in traditional Jewish cuisine. You wouldn't eat anything containing meat within 3 hours or even 6 hours of anything containing dairy. So what makes Jewish food Jewish, in a sense, is its adherence to dietary laws, as well as the traditions of different Jewish communities. If we could move forward one. So 19th century Jewish America was heavily Ashkenazi. And if you look at this map, it shows, using modern nation states, kind of the historical communities of different Jewish groups. Ashkenazi Jews, Ashkenaz means German, Germany. So Ashkenazi Jews are the communities with deep historical roots in more Northern Europe. Sephardic Jews have deep historical roots in the Mediterranean region, and Mizrahi Jews have deep historical roots east of the Mediterranean. You also have a distinctive community in Ethiopia and smaller communities in urban areas in India and China, which go back a very long way, and they all have their own food traditions, not surprisingly. Now, 19th century Jewish America is overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, which means that in this very racially stratified society, most Jews read as white. This isn't to say that anti-Semitism isn't a serious problem in 19th century America, it is. But if we had been talking about Beta Israel Jews from Ethiopia or Mizrahi Jews from Iraq, we would not have this section in our cookbook, I'm pretty sure. So this is a group that comes over speaking German and quickly adapts to speaking both German and English. They're mostly from more urban areas in Germany and Central Europe, and they remain more urban in the US. And there's a trajectory of upward mobility. The first generation are often peddlers. The second generation are moving into the professions with more education and requirements. They're also impacted by the reform movement, which is moving away from traditional strictures and very much values being part of a wider society, participating in a wider society that is mostly not Jewish. And it's owing to this that 19th century Jewish cookbooks are published where the reform movement is big: Germany, Britain, and North America. So Esther Levy published the first American Jewish cookbook in 1871. The first published in English was about a generation or two earlier by Judith Cohen Lady Montefiore in 1846. And like we saw last time, these are manuals. They have information about how to run a household and how to comport oneself, not only recipes. One way we can see this sort of assimilationist tendency in the American cookbooks is that if you read the intro to Jennie June's cookbook, there are all these snide remarks about irresponsible Irish girls who regrettably have to be employed to stoke the fires, because heaven forbid a lady, even one of poor means, should have to stoke her own fires. Jewish cookbooks in North America do the same thing. So speaking of the assimilationist tendency and the willingness to sort of assert one's own status by pushing somebody else down, a regrettably universal human impulse, you do have some very assimilated cookbooks. Another early one from the US is called Aunt Babette's Cookbook, Foreign and Domestic Receipts for the Household. So it's published by a Jewish press with a Star of David logo. And yet, you open this cookbook and you find a whole section on Easter dishes. Not exactly a Jewish holiday, but this is a section actually of Passover dishes. So there's all this matzah and this set of recipes to avoid leaven, but it's packaged as Easter. Very 19th century reform. Another example, the Settlement Cookbook, which was one of the best-selling cookbooks of the first half of the 20th century, was written, compiled by a Jewish author, originally for mostly Jewish women. And she wasn't necessarily aiming to write an exclusively Jewish cookbook. But it's notable that these, it's nowhere marked as Jewish. There's nothing on kosher observance anywhere in it. Or mention of traditional holidays. But if you look at it closely, there are almost no recipes that combine milk and meat. There are a tiny handful of recipes for shellfish, which is not kosher. So it's very limited. And there are very few recipes for anything involving pork. So basically, it's a best-selling Jewish cookbook that isn't marketed as a Jewish cookbook. And by the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. All right, so if we want to look at the next video segment. The recipe doesn't say whether you're supposed to cream together the ingredients or whisk them or beat them a whole lot. Like many recipes of this period, you don't have really extensive instructions, and it's sort of assumed that you'll know how the ingredients are supposed to be mixed and about what temperature to use to cook them. Of course, you may well be you probably are using a wood-burning stove, so that's another issue. But I figure that if these ingredients were supposed to be really, really well blended, probably the recipe would have said something about that. So I did kind of a light, easy job of creaming them together. The dough, as for the recipe, wound up being actually quite dry. You don't want a terribly wet dough or anything like this, but really, really dry and not fully blended. So I wound up adding a bit more milk. And now that this is all blended together, it's time to add the things that make this in my little adaptation of Purim cake. So that's a whole bunch of pecans, an even bigger bunch of almonds, and of course, indispensably poppy seeds. So we will see how this looks when it's all blended together. Here is our about to be cooked cake. As you can see, it got mixed pretty well. This kind of lightweight metal pan is probably the kind of thing that would have been used in the 19th century. I'm sure there have been a lot of changes since. The baking temperature is low enough that you might do well to use glassware. It calls most recipes that specify temperature for this kind of thing usually recommend 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Because I'm at altitude, I'm increasing that to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Also note that the recipe does not give instructions for what size of baking pan to use for this, but again, most recipes that have this amount of flour and nut type or other added ingredients do well in a large loaf pan. Normally you want to do, or you're asked to do about 50 minutes for something of that size and density. Again, I set it for 45 just so I can check on it. Because of the altitude, it might need to go a little bit longer than 50, but we shall see. All right, so just following up on that, situating this cookbook, kind of we've gone from where it's coming from, looking ahead. This edition was published in 1878, and in around 1880, that's sort of a convenient year to use, Jewish America sort of changed in its composition. Whereas you'd had, at this point, second, third, fourth generations of German descended Jews who were were assimilated to a significant degree and were very much on board with the modern American project and very involved in the reform movement. You had this sudden change. Pogroms, organized violence against Jews, broke out across Eastern Europe on a wide scale. And you suddenly had all of these pogrom refugees coming to the US. These people didn't speak German, which was considered more of a cultured language. They spoke Yiddish and they spoke Slavic languages. Instead of coming from cities, they came from shtetls, little small villages, often kind of in the middle of nowhere in Eastern Europe. And they were very, very traditionally Orthodox. They were not on board with the reform movement at all. And they had different food traditions. So this is when bagels and latkes and borscht really start coming in. If you look, at that little card that you've seen before, you have these prosperous assimilated American Jews welcoming these huddled masses from Eastern Europe. And the sort of image is, oh, look, we have all this modernity and progress and prosperity, and aren't we glad to be extending our open arms to our poor, downtrodden, beleaguered, babushka-wearing, bundle-carrying brethren from the East? It wasn't always that friendly. Meanwhile, another change that happened around the same time, vegetable oils became much more readily available due to some industrial processes that I don't really understand. Somebody else does. And suddenly, a lot more became kosher. Rendered fat was usually the fat in a lot of recipes, period, before this, which meant that you couldn't use any dairy or combine with any dairy for Jewish cooks. All of a sudden, there was Crisco, and there was a lot more olive oil and corn oil. This eliminated the need for animal fat in a lot of recipes and a lot of baked goods in particular, which meant that the Jewish palate and kitchen could expand. Crisco even published a book of Crisco recipes for the Jewish housewife, bilingual in English and Yiddish, or a lot of things like this. Meanwhile, food became even more industrialized in the late 20th century. And there was this move toward domestic sciences, toward making housekeeping more scientific, more academic, and possibly more masculine, adopting the then very masculine language of sciences and economics, to what was traditionally women's domain in the household and negotiation of gender and status and knowledge, kind of at that intersection. So if we want to turn forward, the global face of Jewish cuisine has changed since then. It's much more international. In the last 50 to 60 years, Ashkenazi Jews the world over have sort of realized, hey, there's more to Jewish cooking than what people were eating in Russia, which was frankly a lot of boiled cabbage. Like, look, there's food that isn't Northern European, great. So one of the best-selling Jewish cookbooks of the last 20 or 30 years is the Book of Jewish Food, An Odyssey from Samarkand to New York, which has recipes from Jewish communities in India, Baghdad, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, as well as Germany, Russia, plus Algeria, Italy. It's very much global. And meanwhile, I was looking up best-selling Jewish cookbooks on Amazon for this. And Amazon suggested that I pre-order this heavily marketed new cookbook called Jewish, Reinvented Recipes from a Modern Mensch. And I looked into a little more, and I found out that Jake Cohen is from an Ashkenazi family, grew up in a very traditional household, is very observant, so is offering all of these traditionally Ashkenazi dishes in which he's an expert. But his husband is Mizrahi. His husband has, I think, an Iraqi father and an Iranian mother, or the other way around. So he's completely transfused a lot of these recipes into this Ashkenazi Mizrahi fusion. And it sounds interesting. And I keep telling myself that I do not need to pre-order this cookbook, or I do not need to call up my nearest independent bookstore and pre-order my copy. I don't need to, right? Right? Okay, so, and the almond cake turned out pretty well. Dense and still sweeter than it needed to be, but not too bad.
Thanks so much, Eliza. It was a wonderful almond cake. And you know what? I thought that the poppy seeds were just the perfect addition. I thought they made it pretty, and you know, they just made it really very nice. So thank you. Thank you for bringing me some. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm glad you liked it.
And I think you do need to pre-order the cookbook, so sorry.
Okay. Thank you for the excuse.
I think Jonah is going to field our questions for us.
Yeah. So basically, the way that we've been running this is you'll send a message to me in the chat. My name is Jonah Bibo, B-I-B-O. You'll see it at the end there. Send it to me, and then I will field them to the panel, and we'll go until we're out of time or out of questions. So feel free to start sending them my way. Okay, we have our first question from Dan McInerney. Jamie, you briefly mentioned a celebration of indigenous foods in revolutionary Mexico. In your studies of 19th/20th century Latin American political culture, have you come across broader expressions of a Republican food culture in other nations? Perhaps, as with the tortilla, the political appropriateness of simple, authentic, nutritious food to sustain good Republicans?
That's a great question, Dan, and no, I haven't found that. You know, that is interesting. You know, you don't see as many popular cookbooks early on. There's some early on in Mexico, but they tend to be more toward an elite audience, and there's a, you know, in sort of in contest with a popular republicanism, which was really more promoted often by middle and popular classes. There's also very much amongst many of the wealthy elite letrado class a desire to imitate Europe, and so often these cookbooks, you know, often focus on European recipes, or recipes start European, or sort of making local cooking seem more you know, respectable. And so now by the time that the cookbooks La Cocina del Posillo come around, they are already much more willing to put in many more local traditional Mexican dishes. Though again, not all of them. Some dishes were more seen as more associated with the lower classes, even though the dishes could be very similar. And others were seen as more sort of acceptable. And actually, sopa de tortilla was early on seen as a national dish. But then, at least in Mexico, it is with the revolution that you begin to definitely see the celebration of indigenous culture and the indigenous past, even if often actual indigenous people still were discriminated against and not treated particularly well.
Okay, the next question is from Fran Titchener, who first says, thank you so much to both of you, and I agree. Thanks again to our wonderful cooks and presenters. The first one is for Jamie. When would people have enjoyed tortilla soup in the past?
Oh, it's not a seasonal dish or anything like that. It's cooked all the time. It's again, as you saw, it's not particularly difficult to make. And so, but again, one of the main reasons you make sopa de tortilla is you have some old tortilla sitting around that maybe have gotten a little stale, and since you're frying them up, that really doesn't matter. And so it's just it's a pretty standard dish. It's not like a holiday dish or anything like that. You could have it anytime, and again, but it's a great way to use up old tortillas.
I agree. And then for Eliza, do most societies have food prohibitions associated with flesh? Does anyone other than excuse me? Does anyone other than Pythagoreans have prohibitions against eating vegetables?
That is a fabulous question. The short answer is that most societies, I think, have rules about what you are and aren't supposed to eat, even if they're not aware of those rules. For example, when this comes up in my world religions class, I ask, does Christianity prohibit any foods? And the answer is usually no. Then I ask my class of mostly North American Christians, well, would you consider it worse? Would you consider it sinful to eat, say, X, like an animal that's typically considered a pet? And most people instinctively kind of say, well, that's wrong. A lot of societies do restrict food in some ways, and the vast majority of food restrictions worldwide, religious food restrictions, are on animal flesh. That said, sometimes we're talking about outright prohibitions. Other times, such as in Taoist practice, there tend not to be any foods that are categorically not allowed. What there are foods that are good or bad to eat in particular circumstances and reasons for that. In terms of prohibitions on vegetable foods, notably Jains in India are restrict themselves from eating a lot of root vegetables for fear of harming organisms that could be living in the soil. And there are a number of spiritual disciplines, especially in South Asia, that restrict foods that are understood to stimulate passions like excitability and tend to stimulate are understood to stimulate thoughtless behavior. I will add that I like fava beans.
Okay, I have another question here. Sorry, let me find it. Okay, this is from Tammy for Eliza. Why poppy seeds? Are they indigenous to the Mediterranean?
Poppies with like big seed pods grow very widely across Eurasia. They caught on for Purim in Jewish communities in Ashkenaz, especially for German-speaking communities, because the German and Yiddish word for poppy seed is man. And through some twists of logic, the the pun was noted on the name of the villain of the Purim story, Haman. So Man and Haman, they sound much more like in Yiddish or German pronunciation than I'm making them sound. It was already traditional in many communities to eat sweets shaped like ears and call them Haman's ears. And even to make gingerbread cookies called harmless Hamans, where the kids would eat the heads first. So sort of the sense of Haman being defeated and consumed was linked in. I also think that poppy seeds, enough poppy seeds to use a lot of in a recipe are expensive. And it's nice to have an excuse to eat a lot of poppy seeds once in a while.
Okay. I'll give a couple more, seconds or so for people to send in more questions. But as of now, that is the end of our question queue. There's one. Wow, just perfect timing. Okay, this is from Elizabeth Lord. What are some of the largest differences in 19th century cooking versus modern cooking that are less known or less discussed? I think that can go to either of you.
Well, for tortillas, of course, the big difference is in the 19th century they're all handmade. And so in a poor household, or even that's going to be done usually a gender division of labor, and women and young girls would grind the corn and make the tortillas, and that would be an everyday activity that would go on. And of course, in wealthier households, you would have servants who would do that same activity, as we saw on the cover of the cookbook that Jennifer showed earlier. And by the 20th century, though again, in Mexico, it was more by the after the revolution in sort of the 30s and 40s. The first really big important thing is that even small villages could get a grinder for their maize. So you didn't have to use the Mano y Metate anymore. You had the village, or at least a nearby village, had an industrial mill to grind your maize. And then later in the century, tortillas began to be mass produced. And this was actually a sort of in the 80s and 90s. There was often sort of one company that would make most of the tortillas in Mexico City, and there were many complaints about this company and the quality of its tortillas. And so it began to be mass produced, and then now, as you're seeing, both in Mexico and in the United States, you're seeing much more sort of the resurgence of more artisanal tortilla making, because they're simply so much better than the mass produced variety.
One other thing that comes up, and I can only speak to kind of spheres of Western Europe and Euro-America, but enclosed ovens become much more available. It's my understanding that through the 1700s, we're talking a lot of hearths, a lot of houses having kitchens, the big wealthy houses having kitchens actually external to the house because of all the smoke. But the idea of an oven where you could put stuff, and then a stove top as opposed to a hook thingy, that became very widespread in the 19th century and changed a great deal. More detail will have to come from people who know about things that happened after the 12th century, which are just weird and don't make sense.
Yeah, and just one other thing, of course, that one of the biggest difference now in Mexican cuisine today is the widespread, penetration of fast food into Mexico, and American style, sort of processed foods and everything. And of course, the greatest abomination was that a Taco Bell opened up in Mexico City sometime in the 80s. It did close, so there's some hope for us all, though I've heard maybe that they've since reopened. there. So the widespread, changing food culture of fast foods versus really, locally produced or small restaurants making sort of, more traditional cooking.
Okay, this is another question from Dan McInerney. This one's for Eliza. Eliza, have Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox communities traditionally had their own rabbinical inspectors determining what is acceptably kosher?
Yeah, that started in the early 20th century and then really caught on. Generally, Orthodox certifying bodies, with the conservative movement sort of accepting what the Orthodox said, not needing their own certification, and Reformed Jews either not really adhering that strictly or figuring if it's kosher enough for the Orthodox, it's certainly kosher enough for them. Interestingly, before that, this was really something that Jewish housewives were responsible for determining. And if they had a question like, oh, is this mark on the carcass, does this make it not kosher? They would go to their local rabbi. But in the early 20th century and mid 20th century, it became the domain of male Orthodox rabbis with an organization behind them, part of a larger industrial process.
Okay. Another question from Dan for Eliza.
Mm-hmm.
Is it kosher to cook with a cat in your arms?
I'm not aware of any actual halakhic rulings on that. I have to say, I normally do not have my cats roaming around my food preparation surfaces, but cats being what they are, the minute they realized this was recorded, they're like, well, there are almonds here. We could eat almonds. So Jonah actually did some heroic editing. My junior cat, Emery, who you saw in the video, just would not stop. Jonah, am I right? Am I exaggerating?
You're very correct. He had a starring role if he had it his way, but we edited it out, so it's cool.
I think you should have kept it.
No.
He thinks you should have kept it.
All right. Are there any other questions? We have once again come to the end of the revived queue. I'll give people a couple more seconds to send anything in. Yes, Tammy, as Tammy just said in the chat, next up is wartime rationing and Julia Child.
Yes, join us next time. We'll be back on March 16th, and we will have Dr. Sue Grazel talking about wartime cooking and Dr. Laura Gelfand talking about Julia Child, and I think she's making crepe Suzette, so that is going to be fun.
Okay, it does look like we are pretty much ready to close up on tonight. So Jennifer, if you want to say final goodbyes, we will tell everyone goodbye.
Yes, please check out our library guide where you can get these recipes and where you can see the recordings. Jonah, I think we'll get this tomorrow, right? So we'll repost it in case you want to share it out. And otherwise, we will see everyone on the 16th. Thank you, Eliza and Jamie.